Welcome back. So I had Ryan in the house last week and we did his first lactate test. He reached out to me and I thought correctly that it would be a fun way to spend a couple hours together. So what I'm going to do is talk you through Ryan's first test. We had a lot of things that we dealt with on the test, and it's going to help you get better quality data and better information. So let's just kick off with equipment. What do we got there? We have Ryan's TT bike, and you'll see my phone on top of the table there. I'm using the phone to control a smart trainer, a Wahoo Kicker, and it's in erg mode, so it's really easy to just step it up and down. And then I've got my Garmin Edge bike computer recording data, heart rate data, and the data from Ryan's crank. So what that lets us do is we don't have to use the power from the erg mode. We're using the power directly on the crank that he's producing, and it makes it, the zones and everything, a lot more applicable to the road. Now, I wrote down both average wattages. There wasn't a big gap, but there was enough. It was pretty accurate between the two. And we did a roll down test on the trainer before we kicked off. Now, what lactate meter are we using? We are using Nova Biomedical Lactate Plus meter. And I like this meter a lot more than any system I've used so far. Two things I like about it. You get the results in 13 seconds, which will be important, you'll see during the test. Most other units, actually all the other units I've used before, it's a 1-minute turnaround. And if you're having to resample, or you're in a situation where you want to get the athlete moving again quite quickly, say testing at a track, this 13-second turnaround is great. It's keeps the test moving. The other thing I like is the sample is taken at the tip of the meter. The edge that I had before, the sample was taken at a notch in the side. Really a little bit finicky for me because I do a lot of testing on myself solo, and the tip is easier. Wipe that first drop away, second drop or third drop, you can almost spear it with the tip and you get much more accurate readings. Now, I'm not going to get into the mechanics of testing. You can go to my YouTube channel for some tips on that. Lactate testing for self-coached athletes right there for you. Okay, so Ryan comes in. We start the session with a little bit of chatting. So I want to know, what's your average power for an Ironman? What's your average power for a half Ironman? What's your average power for an Olympic distance? What's the best 20-minute power you've ever seen? And really what I'm trying to do is get benchmarks from Ryan for different durations, bests in different durations, and to try and figure out where these domains are likely to lie. So I can set up a test which will let us see the breakpoints and give us really clear information that Ryan can go away and apply in the field. So, next thing I did, I asked Ryan to go wash his hands like he was about to do surgery. So I want his hands really, really clean. And I went away and did the same thing myself while I set up for the test. And we draw a baseline, which was 1.5 millimoles. Now 1.5 is the highest that I would start a test with. If it's above 1.5, what I recommend you do is you put the athlete on the trainer and you have them sit at about 100 watts until that lactate comes down. And so we started, give you a bit of a feel, Ryan's Ironman average is going to be around that 180 mark. So we started way below, 120. And what we wanted to do was make sure we have the baseline coming in nice and flat. And these early steps are 5-minute steps. It's really just part of the warm-up. And honestly, it's not possible to start too easy, but it's very common to start too high. A lot of athletes, when they set this up, they'll start above aerobic threshold. And so basically, as soon as the test kicks off, their lactate's moving up for the duration of the test. You want to avoid that. You want to have a nice flat line there for a while. So we're rolling along, and you can see here, you can see the erg watts are on the left, the crank watts, which I put in after the test, are on the right, and the maximum heart rate per step is in that column there. And then as we move up, everything's kind of going normally, and then we get to the 180 watt step, and pop, the reading is 1 millimole. And I'm like, well, baseline was elevated, it's gone down, but I'm like, we need to investigate this further. So we actually took 4 readings at this point because we wanted to make sure that we got this accurate. So I confirmed it. We had 1, we had 1.1. Physiologically, I think what was going on was maybe he was a little amped for the test or maybe a little stressed earlier in the day. The lactate's up. The warm-up itself kind of is getting the body rolling. We get close to Ironman watts and we see this dip. And so this corresponded to sort of what Ryan might have been expecting. So we dial that in, and now we're going to go to 10-minute steps as we move up through the zones. And really what we're looking for is we want to make sure we get a stable reading in each step. And you'll see now that we've kind of got into the aerobic zone, we're getting the heart rate stepping up, we're getting the wattage stepping up, we're getting the lactate stepping up. And we're moving through we're leaving the moderate domain, moving through the heavy domain. And while we're doing this, we are noticing his breathing cues. As Ryan's breathing changes, I point that out to him. I ask him how his legs are feeling, how the overall test is feeling and changing as the power's stepping up. And you can do this without lactate. So you could do this whole test, power, heart rate, go up really slowly with yourself, and you're going to be able to feel the domain transitions that we talk about. The first deepening of breath, the breath getting a little more audible, the breathing rate increasing, a light pant, and then a heavy pant when you're under stress, significant stress at the top. Now, once again, we changed the duration. Ryan wanted to send it and go for a maximal test. So as we got up and slightly over functional threshold, I shortened the steps so that we could ramp the power. So the 320 watt step and the 390 watt step were 3-minute steps. And as a result of shortening the steps, psychologically, Ryan was able to give a really good effort. This is the highest heart rate he's ever seen on the bike. And that was TT position as well in the saddle. So we were testing the position that Ryan wants to race. He wasn't standing up or opening up his position. He was staying aero the whole time. So this was great. We're going to come into kind of what I saw in the data in a bit. But what you'll also see here is as we max out, the heart rate jump shrinks. So we get what do we got? We got about a 10 beat jump there, 7 beat, 10 beat, and then just a 5 beat, and then Ryan's done. Highest lactate, 6.7. And I was expecting for a younger, strong athlete to get a slightly higher number than that. We'll come back to the implications of that. And then I checked the lactate and heart rate 2 minutes after the test and 10 minutes after the test. So it went down to 5.2, 3.1, and you can see the heart rate dropping. You know, considering it's the highest he's given it in 2 minutes, we see a, what's that, 64 beat drop. So it dropped down pretty quick. So we take that information. I get my son to print up some graph paper for me off the internet, and we do a simple plot of the information. So running along the bottom here are watts. These are millimoles. The number in the bracket is max heart rate per step. And if you want, you can punch all this into a spreadsheet, plot an exponential. But the risk you run there is you fool yourself because you make it seem very precise, and the overall test, as well as the daily variability in our bodies, is not as precise as what your test might lead you to believe. So you might be giving yourself a false sense of security on the accuracy. Now, with these tests, you build a portfolio of tests and you compare it to a portfolio of workouts and of races. So one test is simply a dot in your life. And you get the information by bringing everything together and getting a rough idea. But what do we see from this test? Okay, well, first up, we saw the lactate go down and then it goes up. So that was the 180 to 200 watt. So approximately, if I draw a line, he's transitioning between the moderate and the heavy domain somewhere around 200 watts. And he averaged the moderate domain in an Ironman where he was able to run well. And that's an important thing to remember. Ironman, moderate domain on the bike. And if you're having a good day, you'll be able to run in the moderate domain. If you're having a great day, you'll be able to run a little bit in the heavy domain. And that's the fastest way to the finish line. So with that, we have the moderate domain, we have the heavy domain. And then where are we going to find the transition point between the heavy domain and the severe domain? Well, if you were in the room with Ryan and me, it was obvious. I mean, you could see how the test changed once we moved. The breathing changed, the whole thing. The way he looked, the way he was moving, the heart rate started to plateau on us. All these things were happening. But the way you can do it is you take the lowest point or the last point of baseline before lactate starts going up, and you draw a line up to the final point. And that gives you a modified Dmax method. And then you look, I just drew the curve roughly by hand, and you try and take the point on this curve that's going to be furthest from this line segment that you drew. And that got us back to about 280 watts, which is roughly Ryan's experience in the field. And then the severe domain is going to be above that. The heavy domain is going to be below that. Now, when we're targeting training, we don't want to be in these transition zones. So in the transition between heavy and severe, between heavy and moderate, kind of gray zones. So if Ryan is targeting big gear work or tempo training, I would encourage him to target the middle. So it's going to be about that like 230 to 250-ish watts. And then just watch what happens to heart rate and pay attention to how it feels in the body and in the legs. And be careful that you don't drift into the severe domain. Either you can use heart rate or how it's feeling or spiking your power. Now, let's talk a little bit more about training prescription. How we might use this test to help Ryan get faster. So the first thing is, before you go trying to change your entire approach, step back a bit and look at training, what you've actually done across the summer, across the fall. And I follow Ryan on Twitter. I follow him on Strava, and he was nice enough to share his Training Peaks account with my coaching account. And Justin Dare, a past champion, Ironman, Boulder, a man who knows training. We were out skiing last weekend, and we decided to have a look. Let's dig in and see what we see. And what we saw is we saw an athlete that raced very well in Florida relative to his training. So he was able to deliver on race day. So thumbs up there. Good execution. And before we would tweak specific workouts and stuff, what we would say to that athlete for the winter and the spring is 3, 3, 3 plus 1. And what do I mean by that? I mean 3 swims, 3 bikes, 3 runs, plus 1. And that plus 1 is going to be a strength session or a yoga session or a combination strength and yoga, something different. Gives you 10 workouts a week. At Ryan's level, he's a serious athlete. Then we're going to say 15 weeks of that. That's your focus. So that's 150 slots. And of those 150 slots, that's what we want you to focus on, not the training prescription. So we want you to try and get as close to 150 for 150 in that 15-week period. And if you can pull that off, then we want to test you again. And then we would see, look, where are you at? And maybe even halfway, we'd test you. And then we'd look at maybe getting a little bit fancier. So how might we get a little bit fancier? Well, something I noticed with the test is an average bike cadence of 83. So, totally fine. Fine for time trialing. When you're racing, when you're testing, when you're just riding, ride the way you feel. But there may be some gains to have by helping Ryan and training Ryan's higher cadence range. And the easiest way to start is on the easy rides, have the cadence sit between 92 and 95 and just see how it feels. Just lift that up. The goal being to get a comfortable cadence from 65 RPMs to 95 RPMs overall. Mine, from a lot of years of focusing on it, my comfortable cadence goes from about 50 to 115. It was not that case when I was at Ryan's level of development. The other thing is what I like to call cruise intervals. So Ryan is well developed aerobically. And one of the things, the next step to helping him develop as an athlete is inserting blocks of heavy domain training into his aerobic training. And the easiest thing to do is just cruise intervals. So you're doing your regular endurance ride and you insert a block at about, say, in this heavy domain, 225 watts. And that happened to be about where he averaged his half Ironman bike. And it feels like real work for him because it is. And we're challenging his intermediate fibers. And then you don't back off to easy. What you do is you back off to steady. So you back off down to the moderate domain, this aerobic threshold. So sitting at that 180, 190 type effort in Ryan's case. And this can be a really effective way to challenge your endurance training in a repeatable and it won't tire you out too much. You can do a lot of this type of work when you build it up. And it doesn't need to be a long interval. It could be anywhere from 3 up to about the longest. I normally put them in, it'd be about 20 minutes. But even these 3 to 6 minute little surges up into that half Ironman type effort can be very effective. Now, number one thing, big gear set. Love this work. So a big gear set would be low cadence, TT position. An example would be 5 intervals, 8 minutes long. And in that case, if we look in the heavy domain, I'd probably have Ryan target 240 to 250 watts initially. And I would say make sure your heart rate doesn't go over 155. So that would put a cap in terms of heart rate on the session, and then the cadence is down around 60, and as a result it's going to be a lot of work, but the heart rate stress is going to be capped. And if you have to let the power go down a bit to keep the heart rate down, definitely do that. And this time the recovery is an easy spin. It's not keeping it going steady. And then after you do this set is a really good time to do 20 minutes, 92 to 95 RPM, zone 1 spinning. Challenge yourself from a cadence point of view, almost like a cool down from the set. And that kind of set I would put at the end of Ryan's longest ride as well as his second longest ride. Now, a VO2 block, a threshold block, and sprints. I noticed relative to Ryan's performance, which was great, relative to his body size, which is very similar to mine, he's not particularly explosive. And I had to look at his power duration curve for the entire year and looked at his maxes, 5-second max, 10-second max, 30-second max, 1 minute max. And so it would make sense somewhere in the next 4 months to do a block where we focus on some higher intensity work. And if you look in my bike sets, you'll see a workout called Power Singles, and you'll see another workout called 30-30s, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. It would be that kind of training. But remember, this isn't where the action's at. This is almost like addressing a long-term limiter. And then I would also, I didn't ask the question, I would also want to know how strong is Ryan relative to the other athletes that he's racing around his performance. Like, are they in his zip code? Is he relatively weaker? Is he relatively stronger? Because sometimes this could just be a force issue. And if that was the case, like if I found, if for example, we're about the same height and weight, if we found that, say, my squat and my leg press was significantly higher than his, then it would make sense, and because my sprint capacity is higher, then it would make sense to include a strength block for Ryan, even though Ryan is much younger than me, and typically the older athlete needs the strength training more than the younger athlete. But this is the kind of thing you could look at. And if you were a female athlete, if you had good power generation but your top end wasn't there, leg press sled is a great way, initially 2 legs and then transitioning to single leg and then transitioning to these high torque, low cadence type sets on the bike is a great way to bring strength from the gym to the bike and ultimately out into the field so you can get your time trialing up. And then the final thing is sprints on long recoveries. When I started out, it was a case of not knowing how to sprint. I didn't have the speed skill. I couldn't actually move my legs quick enough to get the sprint going. So there I recommended once a week, 5 sprints, long recoveries, 5 to 8 seconds duration. So it's going to take you 3 to 5 seconds to get yourself moving, and then just hit the gas as fast and as intensely as you can, but only for 5 seconds. So it's really a recruitment, it's really explosive, not going to tire you out. And that's another tip. You're an Ironman athlete, you're a half Ironman athlete. The higher intensity work is designed to hit those qualities in your muscle fibers that are not critical for race day success, but they are critical for the overall package of your athleticism. And that's something to bear in mind. So you don't want to generate a ton of fatigue from your higher intensity training. The money training is your endurance training and the big gear training and the cruise intervals. That's where the action's at. Okay, Hopefully I gave you something to think about. And if you feel like I missed something that you were wondering about in your first lactate test, hit me up in the comments and I'll answer it for you. Thanks.